In this lesson, we will begin our discussion on part 2 of company law by having a look at the concepts surrounding share capital. Now, first and foremost, in order for us to consider what amounts to share capital, we must first outline what entails capital in itself. So the fundamental principle of capital is any funds which are accrued or raised in the incorporation process of a company, essentially money that's required to make the company. Now, the very nature of a private or a public company, as we have looked at in part 1 of this course as well, is that the benefit that such a company has over that of a sole proprietorship or a sole tradership and partnerships are that of the ability to raise funds or raise money from a multitude of sources. In relation to public companies, from the public at large, and when it comes to private companies, from a smaller pool of individuals. Similarly, when we raise capital, what we consider as share capital is an instrument, so to speak, which is issued in the proportion of the capital which is provided. So essentially, it's a 1-for-1. If £1,000 are allocated, you might get 1,000 shares in place of that. Essentially, it is your stake as a person who has provided capital in that company. And this is, mind you, an investment, so to speak. Now, the speciality of share capital based on this doctrine is that it has elements of both accounting as well as legal principles in place. And we see this quite predominantly outlined in the case of Guinness and Land Corporation of Ireland, where their lordships essentially outline the fact that share capital is this unique aspect of corporate law, of company law, where it's governed not only in relation to the legal side of things, but also that of the accounting aspects. Because the share capital, whatever is provided as funds for the company, is in essence to proliferate the objectives of the company, that which is there in the objects clause of the Articles of Association. Now, note that is one of the most fundamentally important concepts as well. Whatever share capital that is being issued, whatever capital is being raised, is in fact to fulfill the objectives of the company. And that's very important, and we'll see later on in these lessons as well, the fact that anyone who is providing capital and who is therefore granted share capital, in essence, has a contract with the company as well. And this contract, the binding terminologies of it, or the terms of engagement in that context, is based on the objectives of the company. A person is providing money in order to fulfill whatever the company has promised that it would do. Now, having said that, in order to receive returns, because no one makes an investment without having a return at the end of it, before such returns are possible to a shareholder, it must be noted that a company must show that whatever assets that the company has at that given moment of time, when dividend or any other type of return is provided, that any assets that are with the company are in fact more than share capital. Now, this will make better sense later on in our lessons, but for now, understand that there is a separate imbalance between assets within the company and that of the share capital, and it must be so that the former, in other words, the assets must be more than the share capital. Now, having said that, having looked at the primary doctrine and the fundamentals of share capital, we must now move on to consider the concepts surrounding raising of capital, because this is absolutely essential when it comes to forming as well as maintaining and regulating a company. Now, the general principle is that when you have share capital, whatever the share capital that has been raised must be substantiated in the form of money and cannot be discounted. So it's a 1-for-1, as I noted earlier. There is no ability for a person to be granted shares for anything more or less than what another person has been granted of. So there is no concept of a person being provided with share capital in any other form than anyone else for that matter, because you have several individuals who would be willing to bring in capital and therefore has to be afforded the share capital in a similar manner. Having said that, much like in contract law, when we look at consideration as being money or money equivalent, We have Ray Rag Limited back in 1897, which actually considered the notion that shares themselves, the share capital, may be afforded not just in terms of money, but also issued in place of goods and services themselves. Now, having said that, this is regulated heavily when it comes to public limited companies, but predominantly when it comes to private companies, there is a freedom to be able to do this because it's a private matter within a smaller group or a smaller pool of individuals. But in terms of public companies, this is in fact subject to strict statutory provisions. Have a look at Section 593 of the Companies Act of 2006 and you'll get a better understanding of the nuances and the regulations in place where there is a valuation that is required of non-cash consideration which is provided in relation to shares. Now that we've had an introduction to the concepts surrounding share capital, from the next lesson onwards, we will have a look at how companies manifestly provide returns.